So excited that you guys are here after like a super long weekend with 15 talks an hour and like workshops and all kinds of awesome stuff. So it's exciting that we get to be together. And I'll tell you, it's 3:40 right now. We're not going to do a 3-hour thing. You know, we don't have that kind of time or attention span, at least for me. Maybe you guys do. But what we will try to cover is a couple of things. Okay, I want to give you like an outline of what are we doing in this afternoon. Why are we going to cover this kind of stuff? The first thing we're going to cover, the first section of our material, is going to be what the church fathers say about this kind of stuff, right? I was really struck sometimes when I went through training in psych, and someone would be like, oh, you know, in psychology, we came up with such and such in this year. Freud like invented this. I was like, that's cool. Freud's a smart guy, but I'm pretty sure that there were people who were studying human behavior and the mind and the heart and the soul way before my man Siggy, right? We're cool like that, Siggy Freud. I don't agree with everything he says, so that's why I call him that. So that's our first going to be our baseline, our focus, because if we don't have that basis, then nothing else we're saying has a framework to stand on, right? What is the church talking about in this context? What do we believe about the subject? Where has there been some strong patristic, you know, church fathers writing, as well as from the monastic writers too. Cool? That's our first little section, just so you know what to expect. So you're not going to get a lot of clinical content in the first couple of minutes here, and then we're going to dive into, okay, so since we know that part, great. Now, let's talk about this subject, this question of depression, despair, despondency. Somebody asked me even a question as I was just going to the bathroom, tell me about bereavement real quick. I was like, I gotta pee, so I'll tell you in a minute. Okay? But that's another question because we think about, okay, in our context, in our culture, right? Oh my goodness, somebody passes away, and they've been grieving this in a complex way for a couple of years. Is this normal? Is this normal? Let's talk about that. Okay, that's going to be our question. How do we understand that kind of behavior? How do I understand just everyday sadness versus something like despair versus something like depression? And then lastly, we're going to talk about treatment. Usually when we talk about treatment, let's just show of hands, you're in healthcare of some kind, right? Hand raise, almost everybody. When you think of this, when you hear, we've all had to, like by force in our training, learn something about the DSM, learn something about mental health. Usually what we hear are a couple of meds and like therapy, right? But I've had people come to me and say, Mina, I went to therapy and therapy didn't work. So you went to a therapy, you tried a therapist, one particular type. Maybe it didn't work for you because it was not the right thing for you. So we're gonna dive in a little more into what are different kinds of therapies. Is it just one? Did you know that there are randomized controls trials for forgiveness therapy? Just a little teaser, so you stay till the end. Did you know that there's randomized control trials for how you instill hope in a person? That's cool. That's evidence-based. That's spiritual, and it's legit. So that's what we're going to talk about here. Any questions so far? All right, well, we didn't say anything just yet. And feel free if you tell me, you know what, like we're all family here. So you know what, look, you move a little faster in this part. I'm like, okay, cool, we'll skip through it. Or you know what, this is really complicated. I have no idea what you just said. We'll slow down and we'll go over it again. Yes, sir.
Are we going to touch base on whether this is a chronic depression or just spiritual fight?
Yes. And actually, since you asked, I'm going to just throw this in there. People don't usually know this, but did you know that in the DSM, there is actually a section of spiritual problem? Like this is on the boards for people. It's actually a question. Like someone comes to you and says, you know, they have this particular struggle and it has to do with their faith in this one particular way or that particular way. Part of the answer for that context is it's a spiritual problem. That's a thing, even in the secular world. So we're going to make that distinction here of what's a spiritual problem, a spiritual struggle, a spiritual warfare, and what is clinical, and how do those things kind of play, you know, how do they affect each other? We were talking earlier too, is how, maybe if I have a clinical issue, how does that impact my spiritual life? Because we live in this community, so now if I have, let's say, clinical depression, how does that impact my prayer life? Does it? So that's our big question. So first I want to start with just my financial disclosures. Just want to make sure that you guys know off the bat, I do get paid plenty of a bun, so you know, just got to put that out. Okay? And then I want to give a big shout out to people who helped me with the content. So David Holden, great writer in Ocamper, put out a really good paper. You can look him up. Ocamper is another pan-Orthodox, similar thing to CMANA. And they hold a conference every year, and we're going to try to partner up. We met with the president yesterday, amazing guy. So we're going to try to work together. And then my personal mentor and Father Luke, who's a psychiatrist, a veteran psychiatrist, and a great, great priest, was able to merge these two worlds. He's sort of like the incarnation of what we're trying to do in CMANA mental health, right? He's this like priest and doctor and just like really cool guy all around. So I want to give them a shout out off the bat. Okay, like I said, here's the breakdown of our data. The patristic understanding, the current clinical understanding of depression. We want to look to as well as like, what does it do to my mind? What does it do to my heart? What does it do to my body? And we were talking in the workshop, sometimes if we understand this well, it can give us a better way to deal with friends, family, patients, or for ourselves as people in healthcare. We're going to outline treatment, and we're going to get into, of course, a little bit of a brief perspective on suicide assessment and prevention, and what is it that we can do in our community. You know, there's an initiative in some hospitals across New York City of zero suicide. Is that across the city, it's a very ambitious goal, that like nobody should be passing away from suicide in our healthcare system. We should be able to prevent every single one. It's very ambitious. In our world, we should have a similar goal. If we are like fervent and zealous and clinically minded and spiritually oriented, we should have a similar idea of zero suicide. There shouldn't be a person in our community who we lose to suicide. Shouldn't be. And hopefully we can try to get there. Make sense so far? Okay. So, we're going to begin with what's the soul. What are we talking about when we're talking about this whole spiritual thing? When you dig back in the patristic writing, and they did a really great job of looking at both philosophy and what they currently understood as medicine, and they really broke it down. They said, okay, the soul in the Greek is this word that we translate psyche. That's where we get psychological, psycho everything, psychobabble, thing that we're doing here. And it's looked at as like the life force of the individual. That is the soul. The psyche is the life force of the individual. And they further break it down. Aristotle puts it this way. It's like there are plant souls, there are animal souls, and there are intellectual souls, which is us. That was Aristotle's perspective. And sometimes the church fathers kind of built on that philosophy as well. We go on to this, okay? And you can read this well? Yes, you can. Okay. We're looking at from the soul to the mind. Because we're going to go deep dive into the mind. The mind, or in Greek, and forgive my Greek, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it correctly. I'm not going to pretend like any of you guys know how to pronounce it correctly either. But if you do, just raise your hand and say, my mom's Greek or something, and it's actually logistikos. This is, as far as I can tell, it's logistikon, which is the intellect. The intellect, or the rational aspect of the soul. Okay? And part of this is called, and the other part of it is called the dianeia. But the most important part, when you read, before this presentation, when I was just curious about what the church fathers talk about, they talk about this thing called the nous. The nous. The mind, like, I'll tell you where I first heard this term. I was hanging out in the monastery, in the one in Texas, and I was like, hey guys, tell me like spiritual, like monk stuff. He was like, you must protect the nous. I was like, come again? Mean that. He said, you have to guard your heart, right? Above all else, that's where all the issues of life come out of. And it's not just your heart, it's like the mind of your heart. It's the place where all the issues of life flow. It's the place that you must have a fortress around, and you must know what's coming in, and you gotta know what's coming out. It's like customs. Some of you guys are Canadian, right? Some people are. Like when we go through customs, we get randomly selected every single time. Because there's very strong, like, hey, you can't, not everybody can just come in here. And for our mind, the church fathers were really adamant about is like, you must be particular about what comes into your mind, into your heart, and what flows out of it. That's the nous. That's what we're talking about. That's what Evagrius, one of the church fathers that we'll talk about, really breaks down as we go forward here. Okay? So there is the second part. So we talked first, the first general part was the logistikon, and then we get into the second part of the soul, or the mind here, of the, called the epithymikon. The epithymikon. Sounds really fancy. Which is sort of the appetite. This is, if you think about desires, basic stuff, food, shelter, clothing, PlayStation, just like basics. Really core, NBA 2K, just like regular things that everybody should have. Okay? This is the essential part of the appetite or the desire for you to have stuff. You know how in healthcare we have very like we're very detached from these desires, right? If you see people who like make it in their career, all I want is a little Bentley, like a little one, not a big Bentley, a small one, and just a little house with, that's $3 million. $3 million, not more than that. Just humble. These desires are talking, okay? And the third part, the thymicon. The thymicon is essentially the source of like strong feelings or passion. That was what I saw in the writing. Is like, so you have one part that's rational, one part that's desire, and then one part is passion, essentially. Why did they break it down this way? Is because like we had a phenomenal speaker talk to us about science. There are people who almost went like pro in the science of loving God, right? If you're going to go pro, like lately I've been studying like mental health in the NBA. Been talking to an NBA like shrink for a team. It's really exciting. It's really cool. And okay, if you're gonna, I like to play basketball, but the way these guys play basketball is different from the way I play basketball. I think I'm pretty good, you know, Kobe. But the way they do it is so systematic because they're professionals at it. So we are pursuing God spiritually. The way the church fathers were doing it, breaking it down systematically to know, okay, how do I understand the desire element? How do I understand the passion element? How do I understand the intellect? And with it, they put this really nicely. Let me put it to you this way. The soul has these three parts we're talking about, right? The intellect, the desire, and the incessive power. So with our intelligence, we direct our search. Because if you don't have a way to direct where God is, okay, actually a patient calling me right now, it's very interesting. You know what, I'm very simple, I just love Jesus. Well, Jesus who? Jesus who? If you don't know who Jesus is, if you don't have a way to direct your intellect into who that person of God is, then you're not really going to be doing a proper job loving this very simple, babe-like, childlike Jesus that you want to love, right? With our desire, we long for Him. We long for Him in a serious, like, passionate way that's not just like intellectual. It's not just, oh, I want to pursue Jesus so I can have more books on my shelf, right? That's not what we're about. That's not our Orthodox spirituality. And then we actually, with like the incessive power, we fight for Him. There's a beautiful verse that's not often quoted. It's not on somebody's like kitchen table, where Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven suffers violence." There's another verse. It's like a violence verse in Christianity is not very common. He said, "The kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force." And in that, he was talking about that in the struggle, when St. Paul tells us, "You have not yet resisted to bloodshed to fight against sin." There's a part of us in our spiritual struggle to know God, to love God, to be known by Him, that takes some real intensity. Make sense so far? So this is the way the church fathers broke down first how your mind works, the parts of it, because then they build on it and say when things start to go awry. So that's why this part's important. Is this okay so far? Are we going fast enough? Slow? Just give me like a pace. I'm like you can rewind, like TV, like TiVo or DVO. You can fast forward or rewind. Okay, so this is the thing. So with these powers, we love God, we cleave to divine knowledge, virtue, and spiritual knowledge. We really pursue them. This is a nice quote that I think is from the Philokalia. Yes, he says, let's read it together. He says, "Searching with the first power, desiring with the second, and fighting by means of the third. They receive incorruptible nourishment, enrichment, and intellect, and enriching the intellect with the spiritual knowledge of created things." It's beautiful. It's dope. It's artistic. It's again, when God tells us, listen, first commandment, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When you really break that down, it's like, okay, there are a lot of instructions in that of how we can really do it. So this quote from the Philokalia kind of puts it all together, is that we are going to search with one part, desire with another, and fight with another. Cool? Excellent. How about this though? When it goes wrong, from their perspective, what did they see? What was going on when things went wrong? Did they ever go wrong? They describe a couple of different words. A lot of Greek words in this little section here because they're fancy. This one of lippy, or lip. I'm going to say lip because if somebody gives you lip, it's a problem. So first one is lip. 100% the wrong way to pronounce it, just off the bat. But we're going to go with it for today. This English word is dejection. So in the Greek, though, it's lip, lippy, or however you want to pronounce it correctly. And it refers to both, there's some kind of physical and mental distress, but there's no connotation of sin. This is really, really important. Really, really important. Because they describe something is not right, but it is not a sin. If you were attending the workshop, we talked about sometimes we first want to jump to something's not right, it's a sin. Go confess. And I'm going to give a beautiful little announcement from the Eucharist today of like the Eucharist is the medicine of immortality. That's what St. John tells us. So like, it's not just that even if you're undeserving sometimes, you can have received that medicine and it can make you have the ability. Anyway, let me give you an example that they talk about from the scriptures. St. Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 2, a godly kind of lip. There's ungodly lip. A godly type, he says there's a godly kind of lippy or lip that produces repentance. Sometimes the English translation is sorrow, or in this context that we're talking about, that it can be translated dejection. So all the fancy terms that we'll talk about dejection, despair, despondency, depression, dispresentation, like all kind of these, like these for some reason. So he says there's a godly kind of lippy that produces repentance. This is the kind of thing that after something happens, you feel a sorrow for it. Or sometimes, like we were talking earlier about some themes in this conference, there were some social justice themes that we talked about that should make you feel uncomfortable. Like Mina Sawiris, I know he's not here, so I'll give him a shout out. A lot of things he does gives me lip in a positive way. It gives me like positive sorrow. It's like, Mina, why are you going to spend time with refugees and I'm just playing home Nintendo? Like, what? I want to be like you. You know what I mean? That's a godly kind of lip, or a godly life of something that's troubling you to action in a positive way, and there's no sin involved. There's no sin involved. And also when we saw, for even the Lord Jesus, we said, where his disciples were found sleeping because of life or dejection, or in that situation it was stressful, they were scared, it was late at night, so it was rough for them. Okay? Here's a little quote that we'll read together. So this tends to come at times, this is a quote from, I'll tell you where in a second, I think it's Evagrius. At times, because of the deprivation of one's desires, on other occasions it accompanies anger. When it arises from deprivation of desires, it takes place in the following manner. Here's how it goes. Kind of a long quote, but I'll just tell you highlights. Certain thoughts first drive the soul to memory of home. Let's talk about monks. Monks who are longing for a different kind of life. Like, oh, remember when I was chilling at home, I had my mom's cooking, and it was dope. Now I'm in this desert eating food. That's not a good life. So they think about that, and they say, these memories of home or somewhere else to be, and when these thoughts of the soul offer no resistance, there's no resistance that's offered, but rather follows after them and pours itself out to pleasure that are still only mental in nature, and then they seize the soul and drench her in sadness. So we talk about, again, is a desire to be at home and have your mom's cooking a sin? Hasha. There's nothing like, Christmas coming up. Nothing like some home cooking, right? Or Mary's cooking, which I love too, right? There's nothing like that. However, there's a desire that's not a sinful desire, but it can lead you to now despising your own situation. There's a quote I didn't put in here, but St. Anthony one time when he was asked, give me like the answer to spiritual life. You know how people just do that? They just call him to him and say, Abba, give me the word, the answer to all of life's problems. He said 3 things. 1, keep God always at the forefront of your heart. 2, do all things by the scripture. And 3, which didn't seem to fit, is whatever place you're in, don't easily leave that place. Let me ask you a question. Just a moment to reflect on your own life. Have you had a moment at some point where due to an external stress, you were like, yo, if only I went to that other school. If only I had that other job, my life would have been sad. What if I just lived in that other city? It would have been dope, but I live here. It's not so good. You know what I mean? We've all felt that way because we have the same temptation that these monastic fathers had of this lip that comes your way, which is not in itself sinful, but you can dwell on it, and then it can cause you to dejection, and bring you to dejection. Okay. And sometimes, I like this because, again, they harp on the fact that sometimes it's for no apparent reason. Again, through no fault of our own. Why are we going through this part, again, as a reminder, that sometimes in the church, we want to recognize this behavior, which is not necessarily sinful, not necessarily clinical, but it causes distress nonetheless. but it does cause great sorrow, and it's a clever foe. It's a clever foe. St. Peter tells us about the devil in general, that we're not ignorant. You guys remember? Just do a little bit of complete the verse so that we can be staying awake together. It says we're not ignorant of his devices. Like, we know his tricks. He's a clever foe. He uses stuff, but we know his devices more than he does. So this is something that can be used as well in the spiritual warfare that we're going into. So that's about this. This was all from St. John Casson, who's a great writer. So this is dejection. Any questions so far on what this lip or dejection is that we're talking about so far? You can give me some lip later. Okay, cool. Is that appropriate to say? So I should have like an appropriate police. Every once in a while, me to just cut it, please, just glory be God forever. Move on to tomorrow. Next, we'll talk about despondency. Despondent. We said these are all like similar sounding words. So we talked about one, now we're getting to despondency. I like this word, Acadia. This word of despondency. They break it down first, real simple, like phonics kind of English, right? Just for those like me, I learned English as a second language. I don't know you guys. So it's first like Alif, B, and then English. So that Acadia is first from the A, right? Meaning no, like apathy, all kinds of other words like that at the beginning of the A. Couldn't think of one other word. English is not my strong suit. Which says Acadia, though, this is a really cool word. It's concrete, and it means essentially to care for others deeply, to have a deep care for others. I once heard, might have been a TED Talk or something, where someone said, you know, the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is apathy. And sometimes in healthcare, we don't necessarily hate people. Sometimes we do. But oftentimes, we're just apathetic. We're just Acadia, all over the place. You're going to the clinic, don't want to be bothered. You're in whatever setting you're in, and you're just Acadiaing people left and right. When we lose the ability to actually care for others, this is what happens. This is what Evagrius tells us. He begins to describe this idea, and I shared with you a piece of it in the workshop, of the noonday demon. And the noonday demon, this is what happens. The serious trouble that he causes makes you feel like the sun barely moves, and it makes you feel like you're just waiting for some answer externally. I'll continue with some snippets from the quote, where the monk begins to hate the place he's in and begins to hate life itself. Oh man. Oftentimes, I don't know how your patristic or like Desert Fathers reading is usually like, but oftentimes it's very like awesome. It's like they love life, they're chilling, you know what I mean? They're like in this euphoric like prayers and then more prayers and then the angels are coming and flowing left and right. It's amazing. It's so cool. It's nice to hear sometimes. This helped me spiritually. It helped me to hear a church father say, sometimes I hate this place and I hate the other monks and I want to go home. Like, yo, preach. Same here, man. I also hate the other monks. So this was encouraging to me personally, but he was describing a particular reality that was so common that he had to comment on it for all, his spiritual children. Okay? And how this contributes to this further hatred of the place and themselves. So now it's deeper, if you noticed. It's deeper than dejection. Going in the order of depth here, there was dejection, despondency, and you can kind of lead you to despair. So far, so good. Everybody uplifted here? Woo! So glad I stayed for this extra Sunday afternoon conversation. How even monks got depressed. Fire. Thanks, Mina. There's hope, though. There's hope. We're going to talk right now about some remedies. But first, any questions so far about what we talked about? There's a lot of words that I brutally mispronounced. Yes, Mary?
The Acadia, would you say, is that still like not kind of like clinical depression? This is like sort of a one-time experience? Or?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Acadia, is this a clinical depression? So, and somebody asked me this even in the scriptures, like, can we pinpoint, can we, like in psychiatry, we have this rule against armchair diagnosis of people from far away. Like, you can't comment on, like, an American president and say whether or not he has a mental illness. You can't comment necessarily. I don't know if Evagrius had clinical depression. But what I know is he was able, him and other church fathers were able to identify and kind of illustrate these symptoms that are now analogous to what we see in clinical depression as well. Especially when it comes to this idea of Acadia. One of the hallmarks when you treat someone who has clinical depression is essentially this inability to care for others, to care for yourself, becomes at the center of your life. Things lose meaning externally, work, pleasure, relationships. There's this inability to connect with others. Things look hopeless and dark. And he was able to see that. He was able to say, this is something that we see. They attribute it, like everything else, sort of at the time. Well, maybe this is a demonic factor. This is the noonday demon of Acadia. So it's sort of like a long-winded answer to your question there. We don't necessarily say that this was a clinical diagnosis per se, but that they were able to see the seeds of this. Because in his time, or even for the next 1,000 years, there wasn't really somebody to this extent who was able to break this down in this particular way, as far as we saw. So good question. So makes sense so far though? Despondency, dejection, despair, duty. What's the remedy? What's the remedy? So we're going to go through a couple of remedies that they talk about here. First, and I want to throw like a little bullet point, and I'll share with you where the passage comes from that they discuss this. First is maintaining fellowship and fighting isolation. In this section, again, we're talking about things that are beginning to be hints of depression, and they're seeing it, and in like a subclinical way for us or people around us. Maybe you're not at the point of seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist, but there are some things that we can share with you that are important for you to maintain. One temptation that we have when we begin to have these feelings is to close in our world. Isolation completely, right? Someone used to be around, but they're not around anymore. You used to go to wonderful CMANA retreats, but you're no longer around in these wonderful CMANA retreats. Make sure you register next year. Right? So that's the thing, is fighting this first, maintaining fellowship. He says this, again, St. John Cassidy says, God, the creator of all things, knowing better than anyone else how the right of his handiwork and the roots and causes of our offenses lie not in others but in ourselves, commanded that the company of the brothers should not be forsaken. This is a commandment. It's interesting. Sometimes, when you think for us, especially when we're like adults, when we graduate Sunday school, like we barely make it, like I almost failed, but I made it somehow. And we think like, I don't have to really go to any of these things. I go to like meet some friends, but that's it. Right? Besides that, what do I have to go to this? And he's saying is that a part of this is for the healing of our soul. We need the body of Christ for the healing of our soul. And St. Paul tells us the same in the scripture. He says that you should not forsake the assembly for that reason. And the other way around too, let's be honest. If we begin to see somebody who's like struggling, like Miriam she's not here too, so I'll give her a shout out as well. She has a gift of being able to like see in the room somebody who nobody's talking to. I don't have that gift. I'm just like running around like, chicken without a head all the time. Yap, yap, yap. But some people have the ability to say, okay, this person, how come nobody said hi to that person? Oh, because they're in this realm of maybe despondency or despair. So they're becoming isolated from the group. It's my responsibility, I'm my brother's keeper, to be able to fight that isolation. That isolation is the enemy, like say in the Psalms. We're not fighting the person, but we're fighting isolation, because isolation begins to cause breakdown for that person. Does that make sense? So he gives us here, St. John, both commandments, that for us individually, we have a mandate to maintain the fellowship. And then he says for others, it's our job to be on the lookout. Like, yo, what's going on? Oh, that person? I don't know, I haven't seen him around. That person, they're being more isolated. Make sense? Okay. Next one here, there's no place like home, like the real one. The real one. We talk about, even when we introduce ourselves, over the years I've seen like friends of mine, like, oh, where are you from? Oh, I live in Philly now, but I grew up in Houston, but I also did my training in Tampa, but then in Chicago, and then like, all right, I don't care, just where do you live? It's like really confusing. Sometimes we may not have a sense of home. We know, sort of, we grew up in one place, but keeping perspective about where home really, really is, and having this fleeing, like worldly pleasures. You know how, especially now, around the wonderful holiday of Christmas, aka like consumerism to the max. Here are all the things that you need this season. You really need this new AirPod. Like if you don't have these AirPods, how do you live? How do you communicate with the rest of the world? If you don't have this iPad, So fighting a little bit of this of saying, no, these things are not necessarily home for us. Detachment from these worldly pleasures begins to assault the demon of sadness, he says. He says, for sadness is a deprivation of sensible pleasures where they actually present or only hope for. Sometimes, when we see patients in our private practice area, somebody will tell me how I tried to get into this school and I didn't get into this school, and I'm crushed. Yo, I feel you. I'm crushed for you too. But if you today were to get a diagnosis, a terrible one, would this still be the most important thing in your life? I don't think so. For me and you, the things that we prioritize right now is the number one thing in our lives. This particular job, this particular thing, this particular worldly attachment. And if life was to suddenly have a tick-tock to the end of it, would it still be the most important thing in our lives? Probably not. That's sort of what he says, is that they lay a snare and produce sadness precisely where he sees that we're particularly inclined. So the enemy sort of uses this idea, especially for us in healthcare, because we are on the grind. Grind, grow, more, and then you're done. No, more. There's more RVUs. There's more ways to make money. There's more ways to do whatever. There's a higher degree. There's a bigger associate, assistant, professor of the professorness of all the professors. Wow, how you do that? You got published where? Fancy, like Heidi was telling us, what's your currency? Are you in a RVU model, in a publication model? I love that. What drives us? What drives us? The paper? Someone told me once, what you drive is a lot about what drives you. Food for thought. Then they talk about this, firm hope and our interaction with the Psalms. I'm going to give you a little confession, again, about me. I'm Coptic, like you guys. But for a while, when people tell me, hey, Psalms, I'll be like, all right, Agpedia, I get it. Yes, you have to be Agpedia. Okay. You're super Coptic. I get it, man. I didn't really appreciate this until, again, I tried to spend some time in monasteries trying to find Jesus. And when I would, I'm like, what is a source of people that I really look after in a respected way? Oh man, I want to be like this person. A spiritual rule of understanding their relationship with the Psalms was what changed their lives. So they talk about this. They talk about when we meet the demon of Acadia, again, the same demon, and he sows, and we are to sow seeds of firm hope in ourselves, and we sing with King David, because few places in the scripture walk us through the heart of Christ than the Psalms do. In a tangible way that we can meet his heart, and we can sing with him. He says this, we're actually writing part of a book, and this is part of the subtitle for depression in the church. This is, why are you cast down, O my soul, or why are you filled with sadness? Why are you distraught? Trust in God, for I shall give praise to him. He is who saves me. He's the light of my eyes and my God. Our relationship with the Psalms is a tangible. I had one friend of mine who was a family doctor who used to actually prescribe Psalms. If you think about going through training to be able to prescribe meds, you got to be really good at meds. You got to know side effects, benefits, interactions. And I thought to myself, I would not certify myself to prescribe Psalms. I don't have that kind of mastery of the Psalms, but I challenge myself. I want to. So for you and I, we should be able to we should have, or we can have, not we should have, we can have the ability to prescribe Psalms. Healing for the soul specifically. You know what, my man? Psalm 46, dude. That's where it's at for you. A little bit of that in the morning, come back to it. You know? And when you see really spiritual people, I had a chance to hang out with one super spiritual guy in Egypt, and he was like, Mina, this psalm is for you. I was like, bro, he said it's all the meanings. He's like, no, I really think this is the psalm that's going to really help you. Thanks, man. I forgot what psalm it was. Just being 100. So don't seek, here's another thing they talk about, is that don't seek an external solution to an internal problem. We mentioned this when saying with St. Anthony, of not taking rash decisions. This was so wise and so practical to me when I read it. He says this, the time of temptation, when this despondency comes to us, is not the time to leave one's cell devising plausible pretexts. How powerful is this? I don't know how many careers will be saved or at least delayed from destruction if we don't make decisions in our despondency. Man, the alliteration is just flawed. Decisions in your despondency, don't do them. Okay? Didn't go quite well. It says this, rather, stand firm and be patient. Stand firm and be patient. Bravely take where the demon is coming to you. But above all, face the demon of Acadia, who is the most grievous of all, and who on account of all will effect the greatest purification of the soul. That's high warning sign. High warning sign. When they talk about these guys, I feel like we're familiar with like all the demons of all the things. Like, oh, that's Mikey. He's for like, overeating. Don't worry about that guy. But here, Acadia, oh, that's a problem. He's the one with the most possible, implication on the purification of the soul. And indeed, to flee of such conflict in the schools of the spirit, of awkwardness, cowardice, and fear. So basically, the idea is sometimes we feel inclined to do this, to essentially do this, to say that we're going to find an external solution to an internal problem. And then we get so disillusioned by the fact that we find ourselves in a new setting and the problem still remains. Maybe it wasn't about the setting, maybe it was something in my own heart. And don't get me wrong, there are exceptions. There's some settings that we're in that are so destructive, like, yo man, get out of there quick. But there's some that are not the case. Make sense so far? Okay. I think this might be the last part of this section. It's a new kind of self-care. Okay? Before Drake thought it was cool, these guys were saying this. Is our holy and most ascetic master, so this is Evagrius talking about St. Macarius. He says this, that the monk and also the spiritual Christian should live as if they were to die tomorrow. That's not a new concept, right? People go, oh yeah, live as it's your last day. But here's the twist to it that's kind of cool. But treat his body as if they were to live with it for many years to come. This is a really cool balance that we're able to have. We were talking before about when you're going through stuff, things like nutrition and exercise. No, that's not spiritual. The spiritual thing is that what if you were to die tomorrow? So I'm going to spend my day just doing spiritual things. Well, you know what's a really spiritual thing sometimes? Is take a nap. It's very spiritual. Maybe take a nap with an icon near you. But because for the church fathers to have this prescription to be able to say, listen, your body is coming back. Your body will be resurrected in the last day. Your body will live on to either be glorified with you in heaven or suffer with you in the other place. So we live as if this is not our home, that we have a ticking time, that tomorrow could be it. At the same time, we take care of this and we are stewards of this body as if we're going to live on for many years to come. And a part of that, we'll talk about this more in the treatment part, it should go without saying, but sometimes if we misread ascetic literature, oh, they didn't eat for 6 weeks. That doesn't sound plausible. Oh, okay, they didn't sleep for 4 years. And then, what? But when you see the truth of what we believe as a church, is no, it's important for us to be good stewards of our physical being. Oh, I think this was the last one, sorry. Is that when we talk about Christ resembling us in everything except for sin alone, and putting our eyes to the one who suffered, St. Gregory of Nyssa, I love this. So if you're able to remain for one last second for this section, then we'll take maybe a breather. St. Gregory says this. He says, there is one antidote for the evil passions, the purification of our souls, which takes place through the mystery of godliness. The chief of faith in the mystery, in quotes here, is to look on him who suffered the passion for us. Let me tell you this just to keep it 100 again. Everything we're going to talk about today, in this little depression, despondency, dejection, whatever, drugs, whatever all the other words can be, has one central source of healing, and that is the person of Christ on the cross. That's the source of all healing. That's where all good things come from. If that's not the focal point of what we're understanding, then we're going to miss it. And St. Gregory tells us this. He says, the cross is the passion, so that whatever we look to it, and he puts this analogy of the person who looks at it is the one who lifted up on the wood, rejects passion, diluting the poison with the fear of the commandment, as with a medicine. I like that he used the word even as a medicine, is because looking onto and holding on to the person of Christ on the cross, or in this analogy, when he looked at the book from Moses, he had the analogy of a serpent, right? A serpent that was hung, and whenever you looked at that serpent, the poison in your body was removed. this is the central work that we're trying to do as well, is that we look to the person of Christ as the medicine. He is the medicine, and then he dispenses that medicine in a couple different varieties of ways. Cool so far? I know it's kind of heavy and like a lot of text. Thank you for your patience. You're doing great. This was the last part of the patristic piece. I'll run through a couple of biblical examples, but you guys know these. We teach these to kids in like Sunday school, but sometimes it's a different perspective that we may not think of. We may not think like Jonah and David having gone through these like difficult, sorrowful sort of situations. We may not think of like St. Paul talking about despairing even of life. We may not think of even Christ himself saying that he is sorrowful. His soul is exceedingly sorrowful even to death. You can have this sorrow and not being a sin because Jesus did it. And in other places he talks about being grown in the spirit, or troubled, or weeping, or Elijah talking about that he prayed literally. I never really realized this, like reading his story. Elijah's a cool guy, I'm a big fan. That he prayed to die. Like, yo, that's intense for a prophet. Summary is that depression in various ways was identified and discussed and described by the church fathers. And there's a lot of biblical examples of this as well. And that there is specific remedies that we can talk about that are so relevant today. That's my take home, sort of, from where this first section is. And here are some references. And then we're going to get into clinical depression. Before we do that, and I want to give you like a water break if you have water or something. Questions on this first part in terms of the monastic and patristic perspective on all of these things. Yes?
Did that monk Epicurus, did he get help from people around him, or did he just dive more into like the church ways, and God was able to send him messages to these church fathers?
That's a great question, man. I like that question. It was like, this guy sounds like he was having a tough time. Somebody give him a hug or something like this. Somebody give him like extra or bond, like what was going on? It's like, the honest answer, I don't fully know how his like story played out. I just got a book on his life, but I don't know kind of the full of it. I know that he was just instrumental in describing what's going on and instrumental in describing remedies and how you can approach it. If anybody's more familiar with Evagrius, kind of, did he get a doctor sometime? Did somebody like research it? Google him for sure. I think that's a good idea. But it's a good question. I just don't have it. I don't want to tell you something false. Keep it real. Any other questions on this part so far? Okay, great. If not, can we take what, 10 minutes? 5 minutes? Take 5? And we'll start in like 5 minutes, start at 4:30, and we'll get into the heart and soul of it, clinical depression. All right, thank you guys so much.